As China continues its generational leadership transition, its economy is faltering, the Communist Party is stumbling, the authority of the central government is eroding, the military is breaking free of civilian control, and the Chinese people, from one end of their country to the other, are taking to the streets, often in violent protest. China is in distress, and because it is becoming a danger to its neighbors and to the international community. So if we want to understand China's external policies, we first have to look inside the country to see what's going on. And when we look inside, we start with the economy. China's economic problems will define China going forward. They will drive the political dynamics inside the Communist Party, and the party's dynamics will drive the country's external behavior. So let's look at the Chinese economy. After 35 years of virtually uninterrupted growth, the Chinese economy has hit an inflection point, and now it has started a long downward slide. The economy is not growing nearly as fast as Beijing's National Bureau of Statistics says. When we look at electricity statistics, by far the most reliable indicator of Chinese economic activity, when we look at electricity statistics, manufacturing surveys, price indices, corporate results, other indicators, we can see that the economy is growing at only about half of the claimed 7.8% pace. And what is the most telling sign that the Chinese economy is in distress? Money is fleeing the country, and people are getting foreign passports. And this is not just a temporary problem. The principal causes that fueled China's extraordinary three-decade growth phase are now over. So China is entering a new supercycle, and this time the direction of the supercycle is down. At this moment, the problem for China is that its political system will not allow the change that must occur in society, not just in the economy, but throughout society as well. This became clear at the end of the 18th Communist Party Congress in November. Then we saw the new Politburo Standing Committee, which is the apex of political power in China. At least 4, and perhaps as many as 6 of the 7-member body are the so-called conservatives. And in the Chinese context, that has a different meaning. In the Chinese context, those are the hardline anti-reformers. China's problems are now beginning to feed on themselves, and the country is trapped in various self-reinforcing and self-defeating feedback loops. In one of these loops, we see a slumping economy is causing a crisis of legitimacy. The legitimacy crisis is in turn causing a widespread political crackdown. The crackdown makes reform unlikely, and the absence of reform means that there's very little possibility of long-term economic growth. So why is the lack of economic growth so important? Well, because for 3 decades, the Communist Party has primarily based its legitimacy on the continual delivery of prosperity. And without prosperity, the only basis of legitimacy for the party is nationalism. We have to remember that Beijing's legitimacy crisis is causing Chinese political system to fall back on nationalism, which means, and this is the important point, that it's increasing friction with its neighbors. All of this is occurring while the Chinese military is becoming even more powerful inside the political system. Beginning as early as 2003, the flag officers of the People's Liberation Army were drawn into civilian power struggles. And last year we saw the same dynamic in the current leadership transition. This process of remilitarization of politics and policy has gone so far that the PLA either has become or will soon become the most powerful faction in the Communist Party. The military has, from all accounts, maintained its cohesiveness much better than other factions in the party, especially the amorphous princeling group of new leader Xi Jinping. From all outward appearances, the military is already playing this expanded role in policymaking. Senior officers are acting independently of civilian officials, they are openly criticizing them, and they are making pronouncements on areas that once were considered to be the exclusive province of diplomats. Now, the implications of these internal changes are obviously large because the generals and the admirals do not want a closer relationship with the international community. But there's a problem that's even more fundamental than that. Quote, China's military spending is growing so fast that it has overtaken strategy, said Wang Jing of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Quote, The young officers are taking control of strategy, and it is like young officers in Japan in the 1930s. They are thinking about what they can do, not what they should do. At this moment, China's officers, from generals to lieutenants, are thinking about what they want. And as a result, they have become dangerous, arrogant, and bellicose. By their own admission, they are spoiling for a fight. And in a time of political transition, there is almost no civilian leader who is in a position or willing to take the risk to tell the top brass what to do. The military's expanding role in policy brings us to China's new strategic arc. As the military becomes more powerful, they are pushing their country down a path of high-profile force projection. With forceful tactics, China is trying to take territory away from other nations, from India in the south to South Korea in the north. At the same time, they're trying to close off the entire South China Sea because they believe that it is an internal Chinese lake. The big issue at the moment, which means the issue that can bring the world to war, is their intrusions into Japanese airspace and into their waters as they seek to take over the Senkakus in the East China Sea and as they pursue their designs on Okinawa and the entire Ryukyu chain. Today we're hearing war talk from the Chinese capital. We're hearing war talk not just from the generals and admirals, but also from the civilian leaders, such as Xi Jinping. Flag officers and senior colonels who now are relishing the possibility of a war. They talk about a, quote, hand-to-hand fight with the U.S. China at the moment is an unappeasable state. To our shame, we tried to appease China last year as we reneged essentially on our mutual security pact with the Philippines, and we allowed the Chinese to take control of Scarborough Shoal. Now they're seeking even more territory in East and South Asia. New Secretary of State Kerry mistakenly believes that he can try to work out something with Beijing, but he will not be able to do that. What he needs to do is take a lesson from his predecessor. In February 2009, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said that the United States would downgrade human rights in its dialogues with China. She meant that as a signal of cooperation, but the Chinese took it as a sign of weakness. As one Beijing-based analyst said, officials in the Chinese capital were quote-unquote ecstatic because they believed that America had succumbed to the full kowtow to China. In March, the Chinese pressed their perceived advantage. Chinese military planes and civilian and naval aircraft harassed two unarmed U.S. Navy reconnaissance vessels, the Impeccable and the Victorious, in the South China and the Yellow Seas. And in one of these incidents, the harassment was so serious that it constituted an attack on an American vessel, an act of war. President Obama and Secretary Clinton issued only mild private and public protests when the Chinese foreign minister showed up in Washington a few days after these provocations. Then in April, the president sent the chief of naval operations and an American destroyer to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Navy. This show of friendship proved to be another mistake, because in May, the following month, the Chinese again harassed the Victorious in the Yellow Sea. Now, despite everything, President Obama will try to cooperate with Xi Jinping. There is always a renewal of hope when a new Chinese leader shows on the scene. But don't expect this optimism to last for long, because the continuing problems inside China will not permit Beijing to maintain good relations with any country in the long run. In a sense, therefore, it does not matter whether Secretary Kerry will try to cooperate with Beijing, because Beijing will not cooperate with Secretary Kerry. After all, President Obama, who came into office with all the wrong instincts about China, was the one who authored the pivot, which was a necessary correction to the China policies of previous administrations. Now, to be clear, of course, President Obama did not want to confront China, but Beijing left him no choice. And despite our fiscal problems, our preoccupation with domestic issues, and a general weariness, the path for America has been set. The path for America has been set because China will not permit the United States to go back to a period of cooperation. In a sense, Washington no longer has a China policy. Today, we are merely reacting to belligerence from Beijing. The defining trend of this decade could very well be militant Chinese nationalism. These days, Beijing seems to be aggressively determined to pursue self-marginalizing, self-containing, self-defeating policies. And this suggests, at a minimum, that there is something very, very wrong in the Chinese capital. At this time, the most hardline elements in Beijing seem to be setting policy. And it will be difficult for the Chinese leaders to climb down for a number of reasons, but to bring this back to where we began, it'll be very difficult for them to climb down because the economy is in such bad shape. Now our policymakers have yet to admit that 4 decades of China may prove to be a mistake. Unfortunately, we have reinforced the worst tendencies in China's authoritarian system. How did we do that? Our remedy for the failure of engagement in the past has been to promote more engagement in the future. And as we continued unsuccessful policies, we created perverse incentives. The Chinese engaged in unfriendly behavior. We rewarded them. So they continued irresponsible conduct. We rewarded them still more. In these circumstances, why would they ever change? And in fact, Beijing has become more truculent as time has gone on. So it's time for us to confront reality. We have to see China the way it actually is, not the way we want it to be. And when we do that, when we confront the reality of modern China, we can see that our China policies have not been working, that through our engagement, we have created the very thing that we have sought to avoid, an incurably aggressive Chinese state. Thank you.
Gordon, thank you very much. I think we probably have a few questions. Could I just ask you to speak to something that you and I talk about a lot, which is in the mix that you've just, I think, very eloquently described, the posture and the attitudes of the Chinese military on nuclear weapons?
This is really interesting because if you look at the U.S. Community that follows these things, up until about, I'd say 6 months ago, most people said that China had a no first use policy and really meant it. That essentially Beijing's 400 or so nukes, as it was estimated, really were there to deter the United States and perhaps Russia. But I don't think that that's actually true, because if we go back and look what Chinese officials actually say about their use of nuclear weapons, it's very, very different from their official policy. So for instance, 2 times in the last 15 years, we've had Chinese generals openly in public threaten the use of nuclear weapons against the United States. And neither of those generals have been demoted or punished. In fact, these guys have been promoted. China is the only country that has threatened to use nuclear weapons against territory that it considers its own, the threat of use of nuclear weapons against Taiwan. And in something that was especially chilling, which surfaced in August 2011, one of the, I think, the most important security breach caused by WikiLeaks was the disclosure of cables that Secretary Clinton sent out to 4 embassies around the world. And what she did was she disclosed that there was going to be a test of a Chinese missile interceptor test. And she had a lot of information in the cables. But she had a couple of pieces of information that could not have been gathered from the air, from satellites. And these were the models of the test and the days of the test was supposed to occur. The South China Morning Post, which is a paper in Hong Kong, then went to a Chinese general who is chairman of the so-called Chinese Disarmament Association. And this general blurted out, how could the Americans know this? If they know this, we cannot launch a surprise missile attack on the United States. You don't talk about that if you don't think about these things. And so despite Beijing's official policy of no first use, I think that we have to, at least at this point, think about that China may have many different strategies that they're not willing to discuss. After all, that famous book from those 2 Chinese colonels about unrestricted warfare talk about the use of nuclear weapons in connection with other types of warfare that everyone else around the world would think to be inappropriate. So right now we have to be very concerned, and we have to be very concerned for one single fact, and that is China obviously sold 6 transporter erector launchers to the North Koreans. They also may have sold the ballistic missiles that are put on those launchers, and I think that they have, because we know that they have sold those TELs to the Pakistanis, and they also sold the missiles, the associated missiles, to the Pakistanis. This is important because this substantially increases North Korea's ability to conduct nuclear warfare. So I think there's a lot that's open. Frank talks about the Carver study in Georgetown, that there may not be the 400 weapons, that there may be 3,000. I don't know. But I do know that there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot it's not just the technical number of weapons in the arsenal, it's strategic doctrine of the Chinese. We just don't know it.
Great. Thank you. Glenn?
I have two quick questions. There was a report in the Japanese media that the North Koreans may be going for a hydrogen weapon in their forthcoming test. I'd like your comment on that. And secondly, when the Chinese frigate lit up the Japanese destroyer recently with a weapons control radar,
right.
Did you view that as a rogue action by the crew, or is that something coming from Peking?
Two great questions. I think the North Koreans, as Donald Rumsfeld correctly said, can surprise us with their missile technology. They can also do it with their nuke technology. I don't think that they've actually gotten that far with a hydrogen weapon, but nonetheless, most people think that it's going to be a uranium test this time. And the important thing is, you know, that video that people were laughing about 3 or 4 days ago about North Korea's dream of incinerating New York City? What is fascinating about that video, and which is not inherently obvious, but they show in that a missile launch and the detonation of a nuclear weapon. And people are now starting to think that this upcoming nuclear test is going to be coupled with the test of a ballistic missile, which very well may be that KN-08, which is associated with the Chinese transporter erector launchers. And this is going to be very important. We can easily destroy a North Korean 3-stage missile at their sites. But the one thing that we can't do, for all of our power, the one thing we can't do is track down every missile launcher all the time. So this is going to be extremely important for us. The North Koreans already can reach Alaska and Hawaii and parts of Canada, maybe even Washington State. 5 years, they will be able to hit any spot in the United States, I believe, with a weapon. Maybe not a hydrogen one, but a one that can do enough damage. Your second question is the question of the day, question of the week, maybe. I don't think that this was, basically what happened is on January 19th, the Chinese lit up a Japanese helicopter, and on the 30th, they lit up a Japanese frigate, 11 days apart. And I think that's significant because it shows that if the first incident was unauthorized, the second incident would not have occurred. People in this town have been talking about the decision being authorized at the fleet commander level, and that is entirely possible. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that occurs. I tend to think that that's probably right, but again, we do not know. And one thing that's important is that it doesn't really matter where it was authorized, because both of the scenarios are bad. It's either Xi Jinping, the new leader of China, is deciding to use targeting radar on the Japanese, or you've got rogue military. Now, I find it hard to choose between which of those scenarios makes me feel more comfortable. I tend to think that it was the fleet commander, but I'm just guessing, and I don't have any information. It makes sense in terms of the way the Chinese military is structured. It makes sense in terms of the relationships between the civilian leadership and the top leadership of the PLA, that these decisions are being driven at a lower level, and they are then forcing the political leadership then into certain policy positions. So you see the military leading the civilians on the Senkakus. But it's all, I think, part of a broader narrative of the fragility of the Chinese state.